Chapter 2, Innate Behavior Patterns and Habituation. Part 2, Sequences of Behavior. This video will cover the other two types of innate behavior from Chapter 2, fixed action patterns and reaction chains. Fixed action patterns are sequences of behavior that are defined by three characteristics. The pattern is part of the repertoire of all members of a species, and it might also be unique to that species. Number 2, suitable experiments have confirmed that the animal's ability to perform the behavior is not a result of prior learning experiences. Number 3, the behaviors occur in a rigid order regardless of whether they are appropriate in a particular context. Once started, a fixed action pattern will continue to completion no matter what. One example of this is squirrel's nut-bearing behavior. The squirrel selects a nut, climbs down to the ground, finds a spot with a conspicuous landmark such as a tree trunk or a rock. The squirrel scratches a hole with a particular type of digging movement, rolls the nut into the hole with its snout, covers it with dirt, and then tamps down the ground above the nut. You've probably actually observed parts of this pattern yourself, so we know all members of a species do it. In an experiment published in 1975, Abel Eibsfeld raised a squirrel in isolation from other squirrels, so this squirrel couldn't have observed this pattern from other squirrels. He also fed this squirrel only liquid, so it had no prior experience with nuts. When the squirrel reached adulthood, Abel Eibsfeld gave the squirrel some nuts and then observed that this squirrel found a landmark, a corner of the room, and started to dig, even though the floor wasn't made of dirt. So this experiment confirmed that nut bearing was not learned either through direct experience or observation, and that once begun, it occurred in a rigid order, even when it was contextually inappropriate. The stimuli that elicit the reflexes and tropes we talked about in part 1 can be fairly general: light, heat, etc. The stimuli that elicit fixed action patterns are often quite specific, so they're called sign stimuli. Mazur mentioned that exaggerated versions of real sign stimuli, in the example he gives as oyster catcher eggs, can elicit even stronger reactions than the real deal. In some circumstances, other species have evolved to exploit this pattern. Can you guess which of these eggs was not laid by the host bird and contains a cuckoo bird instead? Fixed action patterns are rigid sequences that can't be altered or interrupted. By contrast, reaction chains depend on the presence of specific stimuli and are oriented around them. They can start in the middle if the first steps are not necessary, and they won't continue if a stimulus is missing. Interestingly, the response for one step in the chain often produces the stimulus needed for the next step. For example, hermit crabs use shells of other animals rather than growing shells of their own. As the crab grows, it must exchange its current shell for a larger one, a process that involves many steps: searching for and then approaching a shell, exploring it, and so on. If you place a shell of the right size within a hermit crab's reach, it can start with the third step, exploring the surface. It doesn't need to start at the very beginning the way it would if this were a fixed action pattern. Now, for most of these steps, the response produces the stimulus for the next step. For example, the search response to detect the opening aperture in step 4 produces the necessary stimulus for step 5, the opening. Of course, if the shell doesn't have a suitable opening, the stimulus is not present and the hermit crab doesn't continue with the chain.